Welcome to the new Hague Alien Philosophy channel. In response to a patron's request, we will now move on to the second video on the metaphysical thought of Thomas Aquinas. In this video, we will cover part 1, Aquinas and the problem of the one and the many in the order of being, which includes chapters 3 and 4 in the book of the same name by John F. Whipple. Now, as we move on to the third chapter of the book titled The Problem of Parmenides and Analogy of Being, we find that even though we had already established in the first video that the intellect is capable of understanding what being is intuitively, even if it does not engage in any explicit metaphysics, because it is able to discover being on a pre-metaphysical level simply through recognizing it in things which it understands to really exist. The problem is that as soon as that being is discovered in things which exist, it is immediately infected with the paradox of the one and the many. This is a very old paradox in philosophy, which was known all the way back in, say, pre-Socratic philosophy times, like, say, through Parmenides. Well, in Aquinas' own terms, the paradox of the one and the many comes to be formulated as the following question. Why are there so many different kinds of beings if they all share in the same sort of esse, which, of course, is the Latin term for the active being, which would be required to make them instances of ens, which is the Latin word for basically an entity. Now, this is the sort of thing which Parmenides, in his own way, provided an answer to, but Aquinas finds Parmenides' answer to be very unsatisfactory because it makes a few different logical errors. Now, Aquinas actually did mention Parmenides by name on a number of occasions, but we realize, of course, that his view of Parmenides is totally filtered through the secondhand reporting of Aristotle, who inevitably let his own biases and prejudices against Parmenides get into his reporting. But regardless, as Aquinas understood it, Parmenides argued that being is by definition one. That's our first premise. The second premise is that anything which is not being is by definition nothing. And our conclusion is that it logically follows that there can be no such thing as the many things which might intuitively seem to exist. I mean, to the naked eye, it seems that there's a plurality of many things, but that's an illusion. In reality, there's just the one and its active ising. Now, this is captured very nicely in the concise formula of Parmenides you probably heard before, which is it is. It's important to leave that in the singular form, it is, rather than, they are, because, once again, the it which exists is only one, and in fact synonymous with it, and beyond that there's nothing except non-being. Now, that argument is probably going to sound very convincing the first time you hear it phrased that way, but Aquinas once again noted that there's some very subtle but damning logical flaws built into it. For one, Parmenides treats being as though it were a genus of some sort, but it's actually not that at all. Being is not even the most universal genus, because the second error built into the argument is that Parmenides uses being as though it were a term that always had the same meaning, no matter how many contexts it would be used in. The more technical logical term for this is that he holds being to have a univocal meaning. He treats it univocally, whereas Aquinas, on the other hand, treats being analogically. Aquinas recognizes that being actually means different things, depending on the context in which the word can be used. And between these two, within medieval philosophy, the analogical understanding of being was by far much more common because there was a theological reason why that had to be the case. In medieval theology, you could not understand the word being to have the same meaning in every single use of the term, because that would undercut or neglect to take account of the ontological difference between the ultimate being, the infinite being, who is God, the creator of the universe, and then the other kinds of beings, which are just his creations. So because the being of God is not anything like the being of his creations, like us, we cannot use the word being univocally, but instead must take an analogical stance towards it. Now, in addition to the ontological difference between God as the creator and all of his creations, as the difference between the perfect being and the imperfect beings that he created, there's also another difference with regard to the way that the word being can be used, which would make sense even without any such theological presuppositions, and this is something which Aristotle also noticed can be found in the way that we can have some uses of the word being which are actually much, much weaker than other ones. For example, talking about the being of a substance is the strongest, because a substance not only exists, but is kind of the most fundamental category which grounds all of the higher order accidentals. But the weakest use of the word being would be attributed to things which only exist basically insofar as they make a part of a logical proposition. So negations and privations don't really exist in the way the substance does, but we can still talk about them in a very weak sense when we are forming logical propositions about, for example, something not being such and such a way. If I say that the sky is not red, well, then I am talking in a certain sense about something, but in the weakest sense of the term. Similarly, if I talk about a privation, it might seem to the naked eye that I'm talking about the deafness of a person who cannot hear is referring to something which really exists, but that's not the case. The privation of hearing, the absence of hearing, is what you're really talking about if you call somebody deaf. Likewise, in order to fully understand how Aquinas disagreed with Parmenides, it is necessary to review the difference among univocal, analogical, and equivocal uses of a term in traditional logic a bit more thoroughly before we proceed. Now, the classic example of an analogical use of a word is healthy, because we can use the word healthy to refer to both healthy food and the healthy person who eats it. Now, clearly, healthy means something similar in both of those cases, but it doesn't really mean the same thing. A healthy food like an apple is not the same as a healthy person like an athlete, even if there is a very strong connection between the two. Like, for example, the athlete became healthy as a result of eating the apple. They're not really the same thing, but they're also not totally unrelated. In contrast, equivocation refers to using the same term, apparently, but with totally different meanings. For example, if a country imposes a fine on all imports of fine wine, then you can see that the word fine means something totally different in each of those cases. In the first, a fine refers to a monetary fee. In the second, fine refers to the high quality of some product. Finally, a univocal term has the same form and the same meaning in all cases. For example, the word animal means the same thing, whether it be applied to a man, a chimpanzee, a wolf, an elephant. It doesn't matter. The word animal used that way always means the same thing because it's univocal. Now, to return to the term being, Aquinas considered this to be an analogical term, because although it is primarily applicable to substance, once again, that is the thing you can say being of most strongly, it still can be said of other things, like, say, the accidents that inhere within a substance, or the changes which it undergoes, which are called motion within traditional Aristotelian philosophy. Motion did not only refer to changing one's location through locomotion, it referred to all changes in general. Now, those are beingful, but less so than the substance in which they occur. And of course, the weakest of all of these are the negations and privations, which only exist as constructs of a logical proposition, etc. Now, at this point, we can return back to the idea mentioned near the beginning of this video that one of the ways in particular that Parmenides was wrong was that by defining being as the one, he was very subtly treating it as some sort of a universal genus, even the most universal genus. But we realize now that that cannot be the case, because if we were to entertain this idea that being is a genus, that would force us to redefine things like substance and accidents as particular species of that type. In other words, being would be the more universal genus, and then substance, accident, etc. would be species of that, in much the same way that chimpanzees and gorillas are species of different types of this more general thing called apes. Well, we realize once again that that cannot be the case, because it is only an analogical use of the word being which allows us to not be guilty of committing the error of equivocation by attributing being to the weakest of things like negations and privations, and also to the strongest of things like substance. We don't use the word being in a totally different sense when talking about those two types, and yet they're clearly not the same thing either. Now, admittedly, this much was already clear enough just from reading Aristotle, but the way that Aquinas supplemented Aristotle or went beyond him was by accounting for the ways that the many particular beings differ from one another, specifically in terms of how close they come to reaching the ideal of perfection. Now, perfection is one of those terms which is usually just thought of as almost the meaningless idea that it's without any flaws. But for Aquinas, perfection was defined much more specifically as a certain ratio, almost quantifiable in numerical terms, between potentiality and actuality. Something was more perfect than another if it was more actual and less potential. Conversely, something would be less perfect, more imperfect than something else if it was more unused potentiality and less realized actuality. Now, obviously, the only being which actually is perfect in the sense of being pure actuality with no unused potential is God himself. This is why in medieval philosophy God is referred to as actus puros, or the pure act. Now, because this sort of understanding of perfection provides an objective criterion which allows us to rank created beings relative to one another in terms of how close they come to the ideal, we realize that the reason why angels, for example, are superior to mere humans is because they intrinsically have less unused potential, and therefore they're more act than we are, precisely because they're immaterial. Materiality, or matter, is associated with potential in medieval philosophy, whereas form is more associated with act. So because angels are immaterial, they're just intrinsically more perfect because they're intrinsically more actualized than we are. Now, as we move on to the fourth chapter titled Participation and the Problem with the One and the Many, we find that participation is one of the themes that got a lot more interest among Aquinas scholars in the 20th century when there was a sudden renewal of interest in his work. And one of the reasons why participation became such a big theme in Aquinas scholarship at that time, according to Whipple, was that the word is so ambiguous that there's still a lot of debate about what exactly it meant. Now, literally, participation means to take a part of something. But whereas it's maybe obvious what that means if you're dealing with, a material thing you can take a piece of, it's a lot more mysterious when applied to the notion of being itself. The idea that beings exist through participating in or taking a part of being is going to be, though, a huge theme for the rest of our reading of this book. Now, another reason why there continues to be confusion about what exactly Aquinas meant by participation was that, admittedly, in certain contexts, the term was used in a purely logical manner. It had nothing to do with metaphysics or being. For example, when you talk about the way that a species can participate in a genus. If you have a more general genus like animal, and then man is a specific species of animal, it's clear that man, the species, participates in animal, the genus, by taking a part of the content of the idea of an animal, but it participates or takes only a part precisely because it does not exhaust all of the content of that more general idea. This is why other types of animals, like say chimpanzees, cows, or dogs, also participate in that more general idea without exhausting its content because, well, that's the whole point. This kind of participation, though, is something which is once again purely logical and therefore different from the kind of metaphysical participation in being itself, which is really going to interest Aquinas in the sorts of works that we examine within this study. For example, there are other types of participation which are more real than the one we just considered. Matter, for example, is also said to participate in a form because a given form can be shared by many other instances of a universal type. For example, many different starfish can share more or less the same star-like form despite having different matter instantiate individual, because in a certain sense, the matter in each instance is simply participating in a form which is common to the many others without, however, exhausting the content which those others are also able to share in equally legitimately. In much the same way, substance also participates in an accident because accidents can also be shared among many other substances in a perfectly legitimate manner. For example, not all horses are white, and not all cats are white, but there are some horses that are, and some cats that are. This is an example of both the horses and the cats in those particular instances participating in the accidental attribute of white color, once again, without exhausting all of its content. And this is indeed a sort of participation by a substance in an accident, which is real rather than merely logical. What, though, about esse? Well, in one text, Aquinas argued that a given ens or entity can participate in esse, or the act of being, in much the same way that something taken concretely can participate in something taken abstractly. Now, this is a very mysterious sort of quote, but Aquinas, cites this as the condition for something to be a substance in the first place, because a substance must exist before it can take on any other accidentals. And the way that substance exists is through participating in the act of being without, however, exhausting the content of the latter. And it cannot exhaust that content because, as a created being, it is by definition imperfect, because the only being which is perfect, in the precise sense of being all act and no potential, is God himself. For that reason, the only being that does not merely participate in esse, but directly is its own esse is, of course, God. Another way to put this is that whereas God is being because he is perfect, full actuality, in other words, we created beings are not being, but instead merely have it. We merely have being because we have to compose that being with our essence, which in turn limits that esse to result in only one particular kind of thing and not any other, as we discussed in the first video. When a man is created by God, for example, he receives the esse in combination with the limitations of his essence as a human person. This is, however, a good thing because this limitation is exactly what prevents him from being created as, say, a dog or a monkey, because the latter are defined by different essences or definitions. Another way to say this is that being can be predicated of God essentially, because he is his own being. But for all other things, being is predicated by participation, because our being is not the same as our essence. If it were, we would never cease to exist. For this reason, esse is also predicated of many different things which participate in it analogically rather than univocally, to return to that distinction again. And it's important to note that our participation in being should not be thought of as a participation in God himself, despite the fact that for Aquinas, God is being. The reason for this is that when Thomas Aquinas talks about participating in being, he qualifies that by noting that he's talking about esse commune, which is a Latin word which could basically be translated as common being. Now, common being is something we have to posit to take into account the way that God and we imperfect creations both have being, even though it's not exactly the same, because this sort of common being, which we both relate to, despite our fundamental difference from one another, is something which exists in the order of thought rather than in the real order. Now, this is something you also find in common with things like genuses. For example, we could say that dogs, cats, and horses are all animals because the common thing they relate to, called animal, is not really a thing so much as it's just a concept. It's just a concept of the intellect, something which can be thought of many different individuals without having to make a commitment to the existence of that thing on a real level. Similarly, we could say that many white things participate in a common whiteness because the common whiteness only exists in the order of thought. It's like an abstract universal, something maybe abstracted by the intellect from all the real white individuals, and so too perhaps there's something like that going on with esse commune. The intellect can abstract an esse commune or common being from the many existing things, even for examples as different as mere mortal men like us and God himself. Yet this is exactly why God is not the same as that esse commune, for if he were, then he too would only exist in the conceptual order of thought and concepts rather than the real order of substance. Now, Thomas also discussed this in a very interesting text about how angels could have unrealized potential, which they would have to have in order to be imperfect, which they would have to be because only God himself is. Now, the problem of angels not having any matter leads us to have to locate their unrealized potential somewhere else because they are inherently immaterial spiritual beings. Well, according to Aquinas, the way that angels can be imperfect through having unrealized potential is precisely in their participation in that common being. Because they only participate in it, they only take a part of it, and therefore have their being in much the same way that we do, rather than be their being in the way that God himself would be. Another difference is that both God's being and the common being don't need anything added to them in order to be defined, but this is for very different reasons. God's status as a perfect being positively excludes any additional content. In contrast, common being just neutrally excludes any addition because common being is not the sort of absolute being that God himself would be, because it's basically just a construct of thinking.